Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, September 23rd, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download, and in order to keep it going, we rely on the support of listeners just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit Patreon, that's patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bharavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's get into it. This week, I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Tricia Rose, a woman so nice, I actually interview her twice. So you will hear me offer and her graciously accept to continue the interview. So this is going to be a two-parter. Tricia is the Chancellor's Professor of Africana Studies, the Director of the Systemic Racism Project at the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, and an Associate Dean of the Faculty for Special Initiatives at Brown University. She's also the author of several books, and her newest is called Metaracism: How Systemic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Tricia Rose. Well, Tricia, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm really happy to be here.
So we're going to be talking about your book, Metaracism: How Systemic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free. But before we even get into the super important content of the book, I want to talk a little bit about you, about your role, and sort of how you got to where you are, both personally and academically. So you're a professor of Africana Studies, and the director of the Systemic Racism Project. So you're at Brown. Is the Systemic Racism Project also at Brown, or is that a larger project outside of the university?
No, it is my project at Brown, and the book is one piece of the project as a whole, which we can talk about more as we go along. But there are sort of three parts to the project as a whole.
Okay, love that. And so, how long have you been at Brown?
It's kind of tragic. I've been at Brown for 17 years. I got one of those LinkedIn, happy anniversary. And I was like, what? I started like counting years on my fingers. I was very sad to hear 17. I never thought I'd be anywhere that long because it just seemed like I'd have to be too old for that to happen. So,
well, life has a way
it
of
happens.
catching
It
up with
happens.
us. Yeah. I'm curious, like, what did you study in school to get to that place? For those listening, today, obviously the path may be different. There may be other opportunities available that didn't exist when you were sort of going through the academic ranks. But what was your path to become a professor?
That's actually a very good question, which I don't get very often. So I am from New York City, and I can give you more personal bio separately, but I went to college. I went to Yale as an undergrad, and I majored in sociology with not a minor, but a kind of focus in African American studies. So I studied African American culture and racial inequality, but I also was generally a sociology major. And then I went to get my PhD in an interdisciplinary program called American Studies, where you study different aspects of the U.S., but you use more than one discipline methodology. So instead of it just being an empirical method from sociology, which is more, counting and measuring and using data, or say it was not, say, an anthropology method where you participate and take extensive notes. This allows you to select your methods based on your research questions. And so at that point, I was really interested in how the sort of devastation of the South Bronx had created hip hop. Like, how did this place that was so destroyed come up with such an inventive and innovative form of music creation out of literally debris. I mean, it's really literally debris. So that was my first big research project. But that's how I got into this question around racial inequality from different angles and resilience but also about how we talk about racism. Like what would be ways to do this that might actually let us move forward genuinely. So the path was through sociology and then in through American studies, and which includes African American studies.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting, this sort of first focus on hip hop and the rise of hip hop. And I know that you've written another book actually about that. I have the title here, The Hip Hop Wars.
I've written two books on hip hop. That's my second book on hip hop.
Book about hip hop. That's really cool. What's the first one
I
called?
have, yeah, I've written two books on hip hop. The first book is called Black Noise, and this year is its 30th anniversary. It's still a very resonant book for many people. That's the one that traces the origins to the Bronx and talks about, art and culture and inequality and the post-industrial landscape. And the second one is Hip Hop Wars, which was written in 2008.
Oh, that's interesting. I think about these sort of, you had this area of interest in, perhaps it's because you like the music, perhaps it's because the music was very resonant for you, but kind of this cultural phenomenon that is fundamentally interesting and appreciated in and of itself is also in some ways, or in many ways, I suppose, um, an exemplar of cultural evolution, right? Like, it shows what's going on with people under certain circumstances. This kind of, and we see that a lot, that artistic outlets are often born from suffering.
That's a really good point.
It's an interesting approach.
Right. And they actually, both sides of my whole research project, address it from the perspective you just articulated, right? Which is, the conditions that we're facing, are often the sort of foundation for what we create, but it's also challenged, right? So that is to say, what creates things is the source of a paradigm that we carry in the world. So hip hop was not considered music. Hip hop was considered a horrible aberration, right? Because the idea was that it had no, had no harmony and no musicality. And, the poorest kids in the Bronx and in Harlem and in, other parts of New York City. And they were saying, vulgar things. And so, it was actually, when I was beginning to write about it, it was considered a blasphemous academic subject. Every professor said to me, minus one, said to me, "You'll never get a job. Why are you doing this? You're smart. You can write on anything." And I said, "That's why I'm doing it, because I can write on anything. And this is what I want to write on. If I wanted to make money, I would have been a lawyer. I had a path, there are other paths." So it was actually that kind of thing. And here we are now, right? Now, this isn't a cultural phenomenon, except the rejection, the powerful political forces rejecting the idea that there is something called systemic racism is actually now a cultural phenomenon, right? That trying to end the use of AP courses on African American history, which involves racism. I mean, you can't talk about the history without describing that. There's just no way. You can't talk about the need for what was affirmative action, which is now called diversity and inclusion, right? You can't talk about why that's needed, because half of the country apparently wants to tell you that there is no such thing as sort of significant racial discrimination. So why do we need DE&I, and whatever the acronym might be, right? So they're making, and now the Supreme Court saying using race in any way is actually discriminatory. When, of course, the point of using race in the progressive context is to account for what's significant about it, not to keep inequality, but to make more equality. So it's a similar kind of problem from a different angle. Do you see what I mean? Where there's a cultural investment in mislabeling, refusing to acknowledge, not appreciating the importance of various factors and conditions that Black people face.
Absolutely. And I think it's also interesting, this sort of this pathway of communicating these issues, which is a massive task, right? Like, even as you were just talking, like 50 things came up in my mind that I wanted to follow up with. And, so many questions and so many interesting areas. But I think about sort of these first two books that you wrote, this kind of in some ways investigation, in some ways celebration of something really beautiful and really culturally impactful that was first denigrated and often continued to be denigrated, but did come out of sort of strife. What I'm interested in here is that, meta racism is a book about, like, okay, it's just bad, right? Like let's not necessarily talk about, oh, and then all this great shit came out of it. No, like, a lot of shit doesn't have good stuff. It's just bad for the people who are suffering at the hands of these systems and these, institutional pressures. And I think it's important that we don't always tell that story of, like, and despite it all, they still, because it's the American lie, right?
Yeah. It's really it's why we go to Hollywood movies, right? I mean, we know that the person we don't want to die is not going to die, right? And that's we know that they know that we know, right? That that's not going to happen in real life. People who you love who are at the center of your world die, right? So there's no Hollywood. Now, I'm so glad you tapped into that, because the thing that made me want to write this book was actually part of the hidden pleasure of trying to say, to give affirmation to what's been denied people who are in these conditions, particularly African Americans, but not only to give them a sense of affirmation, which I'll explain in a minute, but also to hope that that affirmation that's provided to them would also encourage other groups of people to really humanize Black people properly, because what happens in the world is that bad things happen, as you said, shit happens, and then when you're African American, everybody tells you it didn't happen. Everybody tells you you're exaggerating it. They tell you your culture's bad. They tell you that your behavior is bad. They say that sometimes they'll say it's because we treated you horribly for 350 years. But then they still want to tell you things about, the bell curve and your genetic intelligence, even though race is not a genetic category. On and on and on. So part of the purpose here was to say, look, you are not wrong, African American peoples, right? There is a system, right? And that system is working in much less visible ways than Jim Crow. And its invisibility, coupled with the public constant denial and refusal, is actually really dispiriting and harmful. It produces an alienation and a despair that few people acknowledge or talk about, because they know it's just no way, you're talking to a wall.
It denies, like, identity. It denies, like you mentioned before, like, humanity of an individual.
Right. It's like, yes, I think the cops are not racially profiling you. Yes, they are. Right. Like, it's not one bad cop, right? Schools where Black and brown kids go, even lower middle class or middle class ones, are horribly underfunded. It's very well documented. The teachers are the ones that get kicked out of the better schools, where most of the upper middle class white kids still go to public school by any lucky chance. And there's this whole, hierarchical system that, when you think you're going to the bank and you think you're going to get the same interest rate because your credit rating is an objective score, well, no, it's not going to be the same credit rating, because they know they can discriminate against you and make more money, and nobody's going to believe or care, basically. So when you start looking at that whole thing, and, I guess the main thing that drove me was like, no matter how much you try to explain to people that African Americans are treated categorically differently than almost any other racial ethnic group in this country, and the history of that treatment produces a system like meta effect. And that meta effect is not discrimination in one place, and then maybe a little bit over here on the other side in another place. But in fact, they are tethered and connected to one another. All of the major institutions and practices and policies that drive them are interconnected. And those interconnections produce much more profound negative impacts, because they not only interconnect in ways that magnify and reinforce, but they happen over time. Systems don't pop up overnight, as you know. They have to have time. So between time and intensity and interconnection, you're looking and invisibility of those connections for many of them. It's just very difficult to explain to people what you're up against.
And I think that it's really hard when we as a human animal, we tend to utilize certain types of, I don't know, maybe we could call them time parameters when we are uh, engaging with the world, when we're engaging with, let's say, politics or social justice, or just our neighbors and our friends, and going to work and living our lives. And it seems to be the case that it always depends on the sort of time scale resolution. Like, that can shape an argument, whether it's a good faith argument or a bad faith argument, an awful lot. So I bring that up because I'm curious, when we talk about these systems that are in place, we know about historical roots of these systems. We also can follow time, and we can see periods where progressive policies worked to try to at least undo some of the most aggressive or egregious harm. But then do they slip back? Do they rebuild? A lot of people will say right now we're living in a time, it's like the worst I've ever seen. It's so overt. Like, listen to the rhetoric around, like, there's critical race theory, or around, DEI being racist or something like that. But then I always go like, yeah, it's really bad right now, but
No,
really,
this isn't the worst.
really bad before. Yeah, exactly.
You're like, that's actually a romance, right? That would be almost romantic. Be like, oh, this is the worst. Like, no, it's been worse. Oh, really? It's like,
Right. And so, yeah, maybe some of that is because, like, a 25-year-old sees the world differently than a 75-year-old. But maybe some of that is also because we get used to the way things are, and that becomes our new normal. And then when things backslide or they shift in the direction that felt against progress, it feels that much more harmful. I'm curious about your take on sort of the perspective of today's zeitgeist versus, let's say, 1990 versus 1965 versus 1920.
That's a really another fantastic question. So here's what I would say, to add to the two or three, really, I think, true reasons for the possible difference in perception and imagination that this might be the worst, 25 versus 75 and so on. I think the other reason is that we have we have into the forces that be in education and in, federal government and local governments have worked very hard, for the most part, in erasing or marginalizing the specifics of the history of race in America and racism. That they can't. Many people are uncomfortable holding two things in play simultaneously. That is one, that there are amazing principles of democracy and possibility and access to opportunity more generally for immigrants than for Africans, who were brought here under slavery. But nonetheless, there is a culture of immigrants and building and welcoming some groups of people in ways many countries simply do not, right? I mean, that's a fair asset for the United States. There are good things to say about this country. And at the same time, there are incredibly difficult, horrible things to say that we have to say if we intend to live into the truth of what we have done, but more importantly, the truth of what we continue to do. And so the other things that we just don't want to know. We want to raise whites who are fragile on these questions. We want white people to be shocked and refusing of racism because they just don't believe it. And here's how we do it. The first way we do it is we confuse racism as the society as a whole produces it with personal bias and individual racism. So if you notice, every time racism comes up, right? Can you see it right away? Like, automatically, America's racist. Nikki Haley says America's not racist. I'm like, America is not a human being. Okay, so let's just calm down with this America reified. So that's the one thing, right? So we only can define racism as personal conscious hostile belief that Black people are inferior, or you don't like them, or they don't behave right, or whatever your belief, your bigoted belief is. That is one kind of racism. But there are many other kinds, right? And if you're looking at systemic racism, why it's so productive as a force right now, in the way that it's working, is that most Americans will say they themselves personally are not racist. 80% of whites say they're not racist. But if you say to them, that's okay, great, you just give it to them. That's really what my point was with this book. I'm like, okay, I'm going to take you at your word, but I'm going to show you what society's producing anyway. And even without your consent, even against your principles of racial equality, this is what we're creating. And my hope is that that will reduce all of this, guilt and anxiety and, blame that they feel they're being put in a position to feel blamed and personally responsible, and say, look, this is a state of affairs. Are we in to fix this, or are we not? Right. So it kind of puts everybody on that footing. And that's really one of the things that was very important to me there, was that we counter this production of white ignorance, right? That we say everyone should know these things, because you can't be a good citizen, you can't be a good neighbor, you can't be a good activist, you can't be a good city council person if you're not honest about all of these things. So part of it was figuring out, how do you counter the story? How do you counter this very personalized, blame-based story, which completely erases the facts about how this happens without our personal consent?
And, I can't help but think about the analogy that I often go to in my mind, coming from my own experience as a psychologist and thinking about these different systems and thinking about treating individual patients from a social justice perspective. That when I think about, kind of like you just talked about, that quote, that idea of individual racism versus the idea of sort of this meta or systemic racist system, I can't help but think about the difference between somebody being like, I'm not a misogynist, but living in a patriarchy. You know what I mean? And like, I know they're
Right.
not the
I love
same
women. I give
thing.
them all. Right. Exactly.
Right. But it's like we still live in a patriarchal system. And I think one of the things that often resonates for me, and especially when I work with men on that topic, is that, like, also, even though in many ways the patriarchy does benefit men, it also harms men. And I think that's an important thing to remember as well. I am a white person, right? Like, I'm Puerto Rican. I have white skin. I present as white. Yes, I have like Latin roots, and my mom was, from Puerto Rico. I'm a white person. I have all the white privilege that comes with that. But I know that systemic racism also harms me. It's not something in this world that is good for me as a person. It's not something in this world that is good for my humanity. It's not something in this world that is good for us as a global community. And I think when I'm confronted with forms of systemic racism, it doesn't make me want to get defensive. It makes me outraged. And that's such an important shift that I think often happens when people start to, I don't know, open their eyes, like literally just start to do the work and read about history and read about how these systems and processes in place have not just gone away magically, they've just evolved and become almost more hidden.
And that's because we've made progress that had to be undone. Some people wanted to undo how the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War movement, right, and the Stonewall and queer movements, feminism. Those movements have had a profound impact on all of those groups of people I just named, in the last 50 years, significantly. And you see where all the pushback is coming from, and the right to controlling your reproduction, right? Pathologize queer bodies and people, right? And trans people most targetedly. Erase all of the affirmative action efforts to produce a temporary, or at least partially near closer to level, but not level playing field, are all turned into reverse discrimination, so that white advantage is simply not on the table, right, anymore. You literally have to, start from the very beginning to prove to people right? That this thing is going on. So all of that is a complex form of backlash and an attempt at a reversal. And that's why things like what we learn in school make a huge difference. You are outraged because you're a human being with an open mind and a curious mind. And if any of that is true, then you would have to be outraged, right? But you can't get to your outrage if you are constantly being told that you're being victimized by the history, and that you're being victimized by knowing it. And so one of the reasons why I focus this way is really to bring people in and to say, look, I'm not blaming anybody individually. Much of this is not only not taught, but it's actually taught against. So we're constantly hearing about a meritocracy. Shouldn't the best candidate be given the job? And so what looks like an egalitarian principle is actually the process by which a discriminatory system reproduces itself. And when you really come to terms with that, it is a devastating reality. It really is. It's a very challenging one. But, and even a lot of people will say to me, how do we get out of this? And I say, look, the first thing is knowing what you're in, right? I mean, if you think you're in a true meritocracy, don't you think that's going to be depressing when you find out that you really did all you could possibly do, and people couldn't see your effort in the same level of quality that they saw someone else's?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, it's like, that to me is much more painful than it's much more painful for me to not know that that's what's going on and to live in a myth and find out later than it is to make a plan and say, okay, what am I going to do with this reality? Right. Same thing with women. I mean, you don't not know you're being discriminated against. You're like, well, what am I going to do with that reality?
Right,
Right.
right.
The
But it
more
is
you
it
know,
it
the
is
better your
internalized
responses.
very often, right? Like when you're
That's
raised in
true.
a system where it's the water. That's how I usually describe it. It's not overt to your eyes very often because it's the water you're swimming in. And so yes, obviously feeling the negative effects, having somebody say something overtly racist or having even microaggressions, having, an overtly sexist or whatever misogynistic slur thrown at you, that's one thing. But when you're operating within a system where things just are the way they've always been and that's how they are, and I don't know, that's what I was taught growing up, and you sometimes don't recognize it right away
Well, right,
because
right,
it's a
because
status
right,
quo.
it's really good. It is status quo, but it is also um, it is. Let me put it this way: though somebody is actually tainting the water. The water we're in is not natural. Someone's standing around on the corner with little vials of like water changing solutions, right? And so there is an action, right? Because sometimes we act like there's no action, right, to create these conditions. And so another drive around meta racism was really feeling like, look, if I can show you how this thing works, we can figure out a way to dismantle it. You can't dismantle something you don't understand how it works.
Yeah. You don't even recognize yourself participating in.
Exactly. And I do think that if we get it off of the personal behavior and we say, look, there are certain policies that are used frequently in Black communities, which are completely segregated. They're not used in other communities of similar profile. Here's what the impact is. Here's how it connects with this and that. And the book does this consistently, mostly by retelling familiar stories, so that people who aren't really studying this can come into the story from a place they might know. But once you really start dealing with that, you're like, oh, yeah, so this isn't just another one bad cop, or this isn't just a matter of one bad hospital, or this isn't just a matter of a judge who mistreated, Kelly Williams Bolar, right, who was kind of aggressive. It is part of, as you said, the way things work. It's the world we're in. But you get a radical consciousness in relation to that. In other words, that becomes abnormal looking
Yeah.
when you do the work. So for me, it becomes, and my students have said this many times, they're like, it's like, then you realize it's everywhere.
Mhm.
So you have a paranoid stage.
Of course. Yeah.
Like for
Of
a while, you're
course.
like, oh my gosh, there was a while when I wanted this thing, Kara. I was like, if I could just get like a watch that buzzed when I was like standing next to a secret horrible racist, and then I wouldn't have to be mean to everybody or nice to the wrong people. I was like, I literally went through a little bit of a weirdo psychology phase, like how can I figure this out just so every day I could survive? But that is also about coming into realization that, like, look, this world is not automatically doing what they tell you it's doing. And so you've got to figure it out. And that's really going to, but that means really learning how to think about what's happening in the world differently. And I call it in the last chapter a paradigm shift, right? That means you can have all these facts, but you need to figure out what story you're going to tell with them, right? And the story that says it's a meritocracy, but then there's a couple of bad schools, or it's a meritocracy and the kid was already headed to jail anyway. It's a meritocracy, but then, excuse number 3. The point is to make that seem as irrational and tragic as it is, and to force people into a more serious, deep examination of these outcomes that a system designed to produce these outcomes has on all of us.
And I think that's an important point that you make, because thinking about a system as a web of individual actions is very much often not productive. It's an easy sort of defensive strategy to say, but I'm not racist. It's a common thing that you see when you see people debating, especially those who are like full denialists, who are not even non-racist or anti-racist, but are like really early in their sort of racial identity development, if they've even done any work at all, is to kind of just get really defensive and say, no, but I'm not a racist. But at the same time, I'm curious about your stance on I guess, the claim or the proposition that systems are still instituted, implemented, and propagated by people. And so I've often struggled, and okay, I'm going to take like 1 second to describe this, and you tell me if it makes any sense to you, because this is the way my brain works.
Okay, yeah, no problem.
So I also work in like a skeptical activism kind of arena, which is, working towards educating individuals about critical thinking and logic and evidence-based decision making. Neuropsychological humility, all of those things. And often when I think about pseudoscience and the way that pseudoscience is perpetrated, we tend to blame the victim. We tend to see people who are victims of charlatans, and we talk about them like they are the perpetrators of the actual charlatanism. And we don't often make a distinction, which I think is important. There are people who participate in a system, sometimes unknowingly, often unwillingly, but they're still contributing to systemic racism. And then there are architects of that system. And those architects have blood on their hands. And I don't think we often make a distinction there. Like the politicians who are actively trying to make policy to prevent Black people from being able to vote are very different than like the person who hasn't done the work.
Well, that's true. I think that's very true. And we should layer our level of, critical responsibility. And in fact, I would say that layering, right, that would draw distinctions between the architects and those who who stoke the flames, right, for people to double and triple down on the values that enable this discrimination. Those people who are running those fires, right, they are much higher up on the responsibility scale. But once we do that, I think it enables us also to say, look, African Americans also have choices to make. They are not 100% victims, right? People make choices, and we need to also hold everyone relatively responsible. In other words, we are people with choices in this world. I mean, if enslaved people could escape slavery, then somebody can decide not to get involved in certain things today, right? It's like, you can't take agency away. It ruins, there's really nothing you can do without it. So I like the layering for all of those reasons, right? Because it does say we all have a responsibility.
We all have a responsibility. We all can make our own decisions, but oftentimes it's against a background of choices that are wildly, I guess we could say, they're weighed differently for different people.
That's right. Right. And they are different experiences. Right. Right. But that's what I'm really hoping also to do here is have people say, well, wait, I didn't understand what Black folk were up against. Like when you really start reading, if you read the book and think like what it means to walk in the world targeted that way, The stories where in Ferguson, a grandmother's in the parking lot after dropping off her grandson for school and realizes it might be raining later. So she spins her car around to go get the boots so he'll have them in his locker. And the cop stops her saying her behavior was abrupt and unexpected. And so he wants to give her a ticket. Now just imagine if it's happening over and over and over hundreds of times. Right? I mean, what's the psychological impact of that on people? Like, we don't even talk about it in that narrow of a setting. So, the more that can, I think, really help people start to think about the degree to which we need to be proportionate in our blame, right, or in our sense of where we put responsibility. But I do wonder about people who work in banks. Like, for example, when Wells Fargo was found with actual memos where they called them, ghetto loans or mud people and so on and so forth, and they literally were saying, target these communities. Like, it'd be nice if we could find a way to have a conversation with those people who read the memos, right? who followed them, and all the ones who wrote them. I mean, I'm just curious that way. I'm like, okay, so what was your point? Was it just racism abstractly, or was it a combination of racism and greed and power? Because, slavery is not just about racism. It's about power, greed, and racism. Right? There's not one or the other. We like to think of it only as an economic system, but that wasn't all it was. It wasn't only economics. It wasn't only race. So it is curious to see what's driving people today.
Yeah, I mean, from a psychological perspective, I would argue that racism itself is about power and greed and status. That sort of the fundamental belief, when you really get down to this, like, let's take it back to the individual level for a second, which I know is not what the book is about. But if we look at individual
right,
views, right, of like racial views, like these kind of old. It's funny because I'm like, as a psychologist, and now I'm going to reference like the dark past of psychology, but these early practitioners and researchers who set out to prove inferiority of Black individuals and actually developed tests and schemas to do so. This was a view of a people being less than. And my argument is that it fully came from or comes from or is perpetuated by the feeling that it gives the person who is making that claim. Because if somebody else is less than, that means I get to be more than. That means I get to access something that they don't have access to. It's my God-given right. I deserve it. They don't. And I think a lot of those systems come from that.
Right. No, I hear you. But I guess where I would quibble with
please.
the notion that it's just another formation of greed, right, is that they already have general greed. So why not just take everything? Why develop a system? Like, you already can take everything, right? Why do you need it? You don't have it for everybody else, right? Who you also want to control. So, it's a little more complicated because it's not just about economics and greed and access. It's also about how a particular group of people, in this case, I would say Black people, construct white identity. They're reciprocally constructed. And so it's that tethering of the other to the self that is what drives some of that, whether they benefit or not. Because one could say if working class people unionized across race from the beginning, we might be in a very different situation. In fact, it was in, working as David Roediger is a really terrific historian who's written a couple of books on this. And he borrows the phrase from Du Bois, who's a very important Black sociologist, the first Black PhD from Harvard, and all kinds of interesting histories about Du Bois, and several doctorates. He's an amazing guy. Anyway, he had this phrase called, the wages of whiteness, which describes a notion that there's economic, social, cultural, and political and identity-based value to whiteness that is like, people experience it as a wage in that it's like valuable.
Yes.
And that is separate from the actual economic value that they actually get, because there are times when they, what I would say, metaphorically cut their nose to spite their face.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
When they could actually have more money, more power, but then they'd have to, get along with Black people. And God forbid, that should happen.
It's funny because in some ways I think that, like, not only do I vehemently agree with you, I think that in some ways was probably the fumbly point I was trying to make, is that it's greed about personal value. It maybe more than just economic greed, which is how the word is actually supposed to be used. But that even in a scenario where you said, like, let's say lower income individuals would unionize across the board, like across, let's say, race and gender, and then they get more economic value, you're always going to see that within that group there starts to be tribalism, there start to be hierarchies, and there start to be factions of individuals saying, okay, now that we're all on the same level playing field, how then can I eke out an advantage over you? How can we're on the same team, but also I'm a little better. And maybe it's because of the color of my skin, or maybe it's because of my pedigree, or maybe it's because of where I grew up. But there's always going to be that tendency for people to claim superiority, and it's gross. But I think it's about, I don't know, where does it come from?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about that. That's out of my bailiwick,
Right, that's a
where it comes from.
tough
But
question to
but
ask.
yeah, but I'm not sure that I think we are cultivated into those frameworks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think that's a biological, imperative.
No, no. I mean, we can be brought together, right? People get together based on religion, and they separate based on religion. They do it based on color, based on gender, based on ethnicity, right? Based on all kinds, and they also connect across those things. That's why the notion of a working class, a kind of Marxist framework, is a class-based form of unity that's meant to avoid or sort of reduce the power of all those separations. But then you have a class-based scenario. And then, of course, you don't account for all these other intersecting factors like race and gender, right? Which they couldn't. And then there's, all kinds of other things that challenge that. But I think the principle here is, how can we begin not just to fight for solving individual problems that we have created, but knowing that those problems are connected to a worldview. And that worldview is about individualism and personal success, and, and allowing a certain level of greed under the notion that whatever I earn is mine,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you couldn't have done any of it without thousands of other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it's a worldview. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
That isn't just about, right, saying, hey, reparations, or give this back, or restore women's rights, but it's more about, well, since we keep trying to take them away, since the efforts to create, true equality and opportunity for Black people is constantly under siege, what do we need to do? What paradigm shift must we develop so that that is not so easy to do, right? And it's not so desirable, right? And that is partly about how we see each other and how we choose to spend our time looking for points of connection. But I don't think we can be successful at that until we notice how we have avoided connecting to them and harming the people at the lower ends of the value scale in a given society. So that's why I start there. But my goal is really to go to, to the point of saying, hey, now we know this. Let's have empathy all around and help each other create the spaces that would support this better view. And that's really the purpose in the long run. I had a question for you, because you said earlier, hey, you can see how, because I know, I wish your show were 4 hours now, but
I know. I'm like, oh no.
I was like, oh, I'm so tired. No, I'm like so amped up. You're fun. You're really, really fun to talk to. So I don't know, when you said, you feel like, it's that basically, and I'm going to narrow it just to keep this simple, that, racism is bad for white people. Can you talk about how you think it's bad for white people? Because that's often a challenge I get. And I mean, I'll have my own answer to this.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because I have not thought very deeply about this question, so I may be pulling some things out of my ass. I definitely have dedicated more time to the patriarchy being bad for men.
Okay, well, you can give me that answer, because I think they can't be but so different.
Right. And when I think you're right, there probably is a parallel there. Is that when men are, on the one hand perpetuating, and on the other hand being re-victimized by the patriarchy, yes, men do. They don't have to work as hard in order to have the same accolades. Mediocrity is
Rewarded.
given a lot of it's given a lot of positive feedback. And men don't have to often do the work that's required, like the psychological work, the work on their emotions, the work on empathy that is required by women to be able to function within that patriarchy. And so what ends up happening is that men are very stunted emotionally, that men are oftentimes harmed because they themselves are there's pressures put on them to bottle up their feelings, to never talk about it at risk of being viewed as like a wimp or a pussy. And, there's all of this really toxic masculinity that comes out of that. And so I wonder if there's a version of that. And this is a question for you, not for me. Is there a version of that
Oh,
that's
you
like a
see, I ended
hyper.
up with the question.
Well, exactly.
No, I'm
Like,
teasing.
is there a
I'm teasing.
hyper toxic blackulinity that comes from these types of pressures?
Well, here's what I would say. I would say this. I would say it has to be on the white side because that's what you're doing with the male side, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course there is. It's white. I mean, it perpetuates white supremacy, of course, but like.
Well, but that's bad for black people. That may or may not be bad for white people. That depends on your view. But here's what I would say that fits your sort of framework, because I think it is a similar point. And that is that, basically white people live in a profound level of fear.
Interesting.
They are very frightened people as a group.
They're very cagey. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they're very frightened. No, because they've created a world in which they have created a specter of a terrifying group of people who just bulk up, as they would say, to run after the police. And the police are like little tiny children with plastic guns, right? But of course, they actually shoot real bullets and shoot people 15, 20 times who don't even have a gun, right?
Who they have no business being afraid of.
Right. Well, they're terrified of them because, and we believe the cops, no matter how well trained they are, that their fear and our fear are all reasonable. So that what you have is this notion that what a reasonable person would do, and you see this in the Darren Wilson case with Mike Brown, you see it with the Trayvon Martin situation, right? That what a reasonable person would do when confronted with this scary, horrible, frightening human being called an African American teenager, right, is so legitimate that they not only react from adrenaline and, limbic system, but they justify that as a reasonable way to function in the world. And that means that for them to be safe, they have to constantly be both on guard if it's a multiracial environment, and they have to be ready to move after a certain point, because God forbid they should have too many neighbors. So the fear is a profound, you can't function at your full potential.
Absolutely.
If you live in a state of fear. So that's number one. The second thing
is it's not healthy. Yeah.
This is not helpful.
No, it's not healthy.
It's really
it's not like it's not. Yeah, it's not psychologically healthy.
I agree.
Yeah.
I thought you were being sarcastic.
No.
I'm like, no, I'd agree. But the other thing I think is really important is that you are always in a position of ignorance that people have cultivated, society has cultivated for you as a position of normalcy. So when you start learning things you never knew, you're wondering, well, like, wait a minute, what actual world am I in? So the process of what I call it white emancipation from a sort of racist framework is shocking and destabilizing. That's why so many people just don't even think about doing it.
Right.
Yeah. And they instead just choose to be paralyzed or just go la, 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 because they don't want to know. Right. And then, of course, we're trying not to tell them, aren't we? We're like, no, there's nothing wrong. It's good. This is all on them. And so I think the second thing is it produces a real alienation, because they're afraid of people, and then they don't understand people, and then they're always making mistakes, and then they worry about it because they've chosen, or what has been chosen for them is a way of understanding the world that justifies their outrageous level of opportunity. And they are forced to defend it based on the way they're taught about the subject. So these are, really troubling ways of being in the world that are really not to their advantage in any way, except the short-term financial advantage. But even that is so badly, it's earned in the wrong way. Like, it's earned in the most destructive way that once you pay any attention, you just can't but feel like, well, I've been participating in something pretty awful.
Yeah, I think that those are all incredible points, and they really do point to how systemic racism harms white people. And in the same breath, it's the same when we talk about patriarchy harming men. In the same breath, patriarchy fundamentally harms women.
Exactly. Right. Let's make a footnote for those who want us to imagine that men and white people are the most harmed by this whole thing. Because everything we've said will be completely erased, and that will be the only phrase
Right.
anybody will ever hear again.
But it
Cara
is an
and Tricia
important point to
agree.
make. Right, exactly. And thank you for taking me through that mental exercise, because you're right. Like, I opened the question, but I hadn't thought very deeply of it, and I was sort of trying to navigate it as I went. And it is an important point to make, that sort of it promotes, I don't know, white mediocrity, and it promotes male mediocrity. At the same time, there's this question that I often have of, like, do you think that when we use language like white supremacy, like when we shift, I don't even call it a shift because I think it's one and of the same, but when we overtly use the language of white supremacy, we're now putting the onus back on this? Like, we're not talking about who the system disadvantages anymore. We're making it explicit that the system advantages white people. And if we could normalize that kind of language, do you think it would be more impactful, or are people just still way too defensive when they hear those terms?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't think we need the word supremacy to make the case. I mean, in meta-racism, I connect the two. You can't talk about disadvantage without advantage, because what people want us to do is imagine that there's this neutral place called whiteness, and then there's a disadvantage called blackness. And you have to say, well, actually, no, that is not a neutral place from which disadvantage flows, right? Whiteness. Whiteness is not the place from which, black disadvantage flows, but it is in fact the advantage of whites taking things that are not evenly distributed, but are now negative things consolidated on black communities that allow for that advantage. So it's advantage, disadvantage, and those would be entirely different relationships between the two in a level playing field, in a non-discriminatory environment.
That's such an important fundamental understanding that I don't think most people have.
No, probably not, because they don't think they have an advantage. And here's one of the reasons why is totally reasonable to me, which is, hey, they've got suffering like everybody else. They have chronic illnesses, they have cancer, they have diseases, they have lost their parents at birth. They have houses burned down in a fire because the neighbor had mental health issues. They had a nephew who fill in the blank. They lost their job. They work 50, 60 hours a week at a brain numbing circumstance that gets them no benefits. People are suffering in all kinds of categories. Race is not the only one. But that does not mean that you can't hold both things in your mind, that you are both a person who has this category of advantage and these contexts of significant disadvantage. To that I say, yes, and if you were black, then what?
I think that's such an important add-on. It's like, I know I have white privilege. That's the most frustrating response.
I like to say advantage, not privilege. Privilege, I feel like, speaks to something elite, which is not what we're saying, right? It could be advantage in any kind of context.
I like that.
I don't use privilege. I think it's not the right word for this, and I think that's why people have been so easy to challenge it.
That's a good point. And so, like, I know that I have white advantage. An example that I often use is, like, when people push back and they go, oh, but I go through shit too. It's like, well, yeah, okay, I have white advantage,
but not because you're white.
Exactly. I got cancer. That has nothing to do with anything except that people get cancer. But you know what? When I got cancer, I got it really early stage, and I was able to treat it really early stage, and I was able to prevent a lot of more difficult suffering. I have many Black patients. I'm a cancer therapist. I have many Black patients who their cancer was not found until it was stage 4. And that was fundamentally because the system did not believe them.
And not only didn't they believe them, but there's the hospitals in Black neighborhoods are impoverished like the schools. They have the doctors that are the least experienced. They have the worst patient time ratios. They have the oldest equipment. So we're looking at like segregated Southern schools in the North for hospitals today.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
They're called safety net hospitals. So not only are they not believed, you know what I mean? Because that's one thing. Say that you eventually make them give you a test. The equipment is still not even up to scale. And all of your treatment in other ways. So in other words, there's a whole network of forces in health that make it not only less likely to be found and make it less well treated and produce horrible, morbidity rates.
So Tricia, I am so I'm so bummed that our schedules are so tight and that we've been going almost an hour. We have to end it here, but I'm not willing to end it here. Like I would love to be able to, because there's so much more of this conversation to be had, and I feel like there's so many more points that you made in your book that I want to I want to make sure we have space to get into. Would you like to maybe come back and we'll do a part 2 and dig a little deeper into meta-racism?
Absolutely. I would love to do that. And everything else, because, we've just been enjoying all these aspects of the book and things around it and other things. It's been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Oh, I can't agree more. So thank you, Dr. Tricia Rose, for being here. We're going to have you back. We're going to continue the conversation. Everybody, the book is Metaracism: How Systemic Racism Devastates Black Lives and How We Break Free. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been my pleasure. Really appreciate you inviting me.
And everyone listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.